During the 1980s, Taiwan had a video game boom. Bingo, Creator, Funvision, Microgenius were among the consoles that were made in Taiwan. But none of these were really original. They were clones of Atari VCS or Famicom. Simply speaking, pirated machines. The first original gaming platform from Taiwan was finally launched in 1990. It was called Gamate from Big Corporation. But this was just a lower-end handheld console. We would have to wait until 1995 to see the release of the first original home console from Taiwan, Acan. Acan was produced by Funtech Entertainment Corp. Most people in Taiwan probably didn't know this company, but its parent company, United Microelectronics Corp., was the first semiconductor manufacturer in Taiwan. That should ring a few bells. You might ask what that had to do with video games. Well, every game console has semiconductor components. For example, the previously mentioned Gamate used UMC components. Gamate's relationship with UMC was also deeper than that. After B Corporation's bankruptcy in 1992, UMC essentially took over and continued Gamate's business. Not only that, UMC also had a more ambitious plan about gaming. Targeting the large Chinese-speaking market, they decided to develop their own console platform, codenamed F16, which basically meant a Funtech 16-bit console. The hardware development of F16 console was completed in 1994, and then after another year for software development, the console was announced on February 1995, with the official name Acan. The release date was meant to be in July for the summer vacation period, but then it was pushed back to October, claiming more time was needed to allow more titles to be ready at launch. It was finally released on October 25th. The name Acan sounded pretty weird. What the hell was Acan supposed to mean? In fact, it stood for ability and aggressive, and plus the can-do attitude, meaning determined to be all-powerful. But it's not clear if they wanted to emphasize the computing power or they just wanted to be super, like Super Nintendo. So, more often than not, they would prefix it with Super. So the full name would be Super Acan. Plus the original codename F16, you could say that it had just too many names. Acan's design looks rather like mixing up Super Famicom and SNES and then painting everything in dark gray. Power, reset, and eject buttons are suspiciously similar to Super Famicom. The overall exterior, such as the sharpness and the blocky feeling, is pretty close to that of a SNES. Acan's gamepad is also quite the same as Super Famicom, using the same ABXY buttons with the identical color scheme. The only difference is buttons and the color mapping are not in the same order, and the D-pad has a circular feature in it. However, the button's tactile feel is way worse. The shoulder buttons are very short, and it feels pretty stiff to press them. All in all, the holding feeling of this gamepad is okay, but the modeling and the button quality are just bad. By the way, though it uses a 9-pin connector just like Mega Drive does, they are not compatible with each other. As for the video output, there are only composite video and RF outputs. There are no S-video or better options available. Even though the lifespan of Acan was short, and there were many units produced, we could still find different versions among them. The early version included RF output, but it was removed to cost down in the later version. Let's see what's inside the machine. Acan's primary CPU uses the MC68000 processor, which is also used in Mega Drive and Neo Geo, operating at 10 MHz clock speed. Acan also has a secondary CPU, which is the 6502 processor. It's from the same CPU family used in Famicom. As for the video and audio processing chips, they were developed by UMC themselves. Their specs are slightly better than those in Mega Drive and SNES, and that's why they wrote it all over the place in Acan's promotion. They compared the CPU, memory, background layers, sprites, and everything else, just to emphasize how much more powerful it was. If you're not familiar with these numbers, simply speaking, Acan's design directive was taking Mega Drive's better CPU and SNES better audio and video capabilities and enhance it even more, with a price cheaper than SNES. Speaking of game cartridges, Acan's game retail box looks like this. Yep, it's another imitation to its rival, Super Famicom. They have very similar sizes and styles. Even the internal structure of the boxes are nearly identical. The only difference is the shape of the cartridge. Acan's cartridge has a max capacity of 112 megabit. The actual published games were usually between 8 to 24, with some games utilize battery-backed SRAMs. Most games cost around $33 US. This was about half of what original Japanese games would cost in Taiwan. However, if you think just with better hardware and a price lower than Mega Drive and Super Famicom was enough for its success, then you would be a bit naive, especially at the end of 1994. The 32-bit next-gen consoles back then were launched, Sega Saturn and PlayStation. The market for 16-bit consoles was guaranteed to wane. There indeed was a strategy to deal with this situation though. They announced that a graphic accelerator would be released later to upgrade the console. Of course, that idea was clearly coming from Sega's 32X. Not only it could enhance 2D graphics, it was also to add 3D polygon functionalities. Also, there's an expansion port on the side of the machine, planned for the CD-ROM drive. But none of these add-ons were ever released. Beyond hardware advantages, Acan's best selling point was the original games in Chinese, which foreign companies wouldn't have made. Tens of Taiwanese game developers got on the ride, and they even claimed to have the US and Japanese developers joining. Now, let's take a look at Acan's lineup of games. Acan's game number 1, Formosa Duel. It's a match 3 game. The player controls a pair of chicken or egg blocks, and matching up 3 chickens of the same color will remove them. When you make chained matches, you will then throw egg blocks at your opponent. Eggs of the same color do not get removed even when matched up. However, for every chicken you remove, its nearby eggs will be turned into chickens, allowing further chain reactions to happen. There are patterns for different characters when throwing eggs at the opponent. If you can recognize it, then you will be able to counterattack efficiently, creating an exciting back and forth chaining and matching competition. However, this was basically a clone of Konami's Tyson Puzzle Dama. There was really no innovative idea in this game. But I don't want to dismiss this game just because of that. Despite the identical rules, the most interesting thing in this game is it parodies numerous well-known political figures in Taiwan at the time. They perform hilarious actions and make funny voiceovers in Taiwanese, attacking or being attacked. The Taiwanese voiceover in the game is very impressive and spectacular, definitely not seen before in any console games in that era. Compared to Konami's original game, Formosa Duel with a localized theme and voiceover would be more fun and show more affinity for Taiwanese people. But otherwise, the content of Formosa Duel is quite slim. The game only features 6 characters, soundtracks and scenes with little variety, and its control is also somewhat unresponsive. From what I could remember from Popcorn Gaming Channel, there should have been more characters. Especially there was a guy in a Superman outfit that parodied Chen Sui-bian, but it's not in the Acan retail version. Perhaps it was added after the game had been featured on the channel. Unfortunately, that means we can't enjoy the complete content with the retail copy. Sengo Fighter from Panda Entertainment was one of the best-known Taiwanese games from the DOS era. It even had some popularity among foreign gamers. With the Acan port, it possibly became the best-known game of the platform. It's a typical one-on-one fighting game with 12 characters. Each character has 4 to 5 special moves. The game doesn't have the combo idea, thus normal attack is not too useful. You play this game by doing the footsies and special attacks as fast as you can. Of course, it needs to be said that the voiceover is in Mandarin, which adds a lot to the atmosphere of the game. When Sengo Fighter was released on Acan, the much improved Sengo Fighter 2 was already released on PC, thus making the first game a bit outdated. However, the PC and console markets were quite separated back then, with little influence on each other. On the other hand, this Sengo Fighter is not a direct port. Compared to the PC version, there are many differences. First of all, the interface is different. The Acan port shows the health bar on the top of the screen, unlike the PC version that shows it in a separate window at the bottom. The performance is also improved a lot, to a standard that's comparable to its sequel. Everything becomes way smoother than the PC version. Instead of just one kick and punch moves, they now also have the heavy and light variants to utilize the 4 gamepad buttons. Audio-wise, it will now also call the names of the fighters at the start of the game, and of course it will also announce who the winner is. To better use the multi-layer capability of Acan, the port is also upgraded to show multi-layer backgrounds. However, as a game that was designed with single-layer backgrounds originally, this adaptation doesn't exactly work out, and it even weakens the completeness of the graphics. At least, they did put in some efforts porting it to make the game feel more like a full-fledged arcade or console game. Although the Acan port is improved in many aspects, there are some parts that do get worse. For instance, the smoothness is better than the PC version, but some of the animations actually contain less frames. What's even weirder is that before every fight, the fighters won't show up until the fight start voiceover is uttered. I think these aren't necessarily hardware problems, but more like programming mistakes due to inexperience. Also, there are some content that is cut from the Acan port. The single-player campaign in the PC version is completely missing here. So we're only left with the arcade mode. Even in this mode, the bonus stage that will show up every other few fights is also missing in Acan's version. I first thought that the Acan port with its numerous modifications in Street Fighter 2's term was already turbo-worthy, and there even is a collector's edition mark on the retail box. But unfortunately, maybe due to storage limitations or development time constraints, we can only call it a collector's downgraded edition, I guess. Strictly speaking, Sengo Fighter isn't a very good fighting game. Visuals, sounds, smoothness, control, hit detection, and the depth of gameplay, all of them are not as good as classics like Street Fighter 2. but as Acan's only fighting game, it's at least quite playable. Then again, if you really have to play single fighter, I would suggest playing Single Fighter 2 on PC. Regrettably, this franchise died with the disappearance of Panda Entertainment. Among Acan's 5 launch titles, Son of Evil is the only game that was developed by Fontech themselves and was seen as Acan's flagship product back then. However, the visual design of the title and the game itself, for a flagship product, it's really unappealing. At a first glance, Son of Evil is the typical Chinese RPG with a mediocre art style and an old-fashioned wuxia story, not to mention the clear imitations of other classic RPGs. The in-game character sprites are extremely similar to those of Final Fantasy IV and V, even the character illustrations are in the same style. However, a game without any unique feature wouldn't be regarded as their flagship game. Other than being one of the few Chinese RPGs on the console market, the main feature of Son of Evil was a design that had almost never before seen in other Taiwanese RPGs at the time: the freedom of choice. First of all, when talking to the NPCs, there are options to decide what to talk about. Most of the options are keywords that it can use to gather information, and it can be repeated multiple times. Since the intention is for the players to go through all of them, this part doesn't consist meaningful choices, so there isn't much freedom yet. What really builds up the idea of freedom are those key choices that you can only make once in the game. Depending on your choices, some battles may or may not happen, the flow of events may be altered, companions may join at a different timing, and some moral choices will affect the protagonist to be good or evil. Strictly speaking, these choices don't affect the overall direction of the story, and probably aren't that free by today's standard. But for a 16-bit era RPG, I think it already distinguished itself from the others. Story-wise, Son of Evil is actually a protagonist. The basic idea is still the classic hero's journey stuff. But due to the fact that protagonist is Son of Evil, the ideas such as human is more evil than the devil, and evil is not something physical but in our minds, are incorporated in the story. Though due to the story limitations, it only scratches the surface of these ideas. At least they already make the game not dull. Also, the game has a few instances that break the fourth wall, such as the NPC that admits they don't serve any purpose, a sheep that tells you please don't talk to a sheep, the protagonist makes fun of the game after he gets kicked out of NPC's houses, or more seriously, the monsters criticize you for killing and looting under the banner of justice. I don't know why these dialogues were written in the first place. Maybe they were intended as a meta-sarcasm, or just cheap jokes, but at least it really makes me want to talk to all NPCs. As a flagship product, Son of Evil was also responsible for showing off the hardware capabilities at the time. Occasionally, there are off-screen cutscenes during in-game events, but the quality of the illustration isn't so good. On the other hand, there is a Final Fantasy airship equivalent in the game, which is a dragon that lets you quickly move across the overworld, and the map will be displayed scanline by scanline with perspective, essentially the same as SNES Mode 7. However, it's already very close to the end when the player acquires the dragon, so it's more of a functionality showcase rather than being useful. There are lots of traps in dungeons, but the paths are usually not too complicated, not enough to get lost at least. But surprisingly, when you reach the final dungeon, all of a sudden a minimap just pops out of nowhere. Why you not make this useful stuff available earlier? I can only guess it's just like the dragon. It was added in the game during late development when developers knew more about how to utilize some of the more advanced functions. Actually, Son of Evil doesn't have too much content. So just like most of other Taiwanese RPGs at the time, it forces you to grind for levels just to make you play longer. With unbalanced enemies in your way, if you don't grind, it will be extra hard for you to beat the boss fights. Even worse, there is a village in the game where you can't leave if you don't win a certain fight. If you enter the village prematurely and unfortunately save the game there, you will face a dilemma where you can't win and also you can't grind a level. So if you want your playthrough smooth, you have to spend time grinding. Luckily, the game isn't too hard to level up. One thing worth mentioning is Acan's gamepad has a turbo switch, allowing simulating rapid pressing of the buttons, so I can just hold the button to fight automatically, making the grind much easier. It's funny because turbo is usually for action or shooter games, but this RPG is the only Acan game that I ever need to use this function for. Truth be told, Son of Evil is no eye candy, and with obvious flaws, but if you can also feel the efforts that was put in, loosen up the standard a bit, it's really not a bad game. As long as you don't hate RPGs, it can be seen as one of the best arcane games. Well, it's hard to play if you don't know Chinese though. Speedy Dragon is a side-scrolling platformer. Speaking plainly, it's just a back clone of Sonic the Hedgehog. It features high-speed movements just like Sonic, and you can easily see the similarities in the level and trap designs. It's also very apparent where the dash move comes from. Even the themes and visual styles of the levels are pretty much the same as Sonic. Of course, there are differences in the gameplay. Say, the player's main attack move is this batting move, and it looks like it was straight out from Strider. Well, I guess one can then argue that this game should be named Sonic Strider. Since the game requires an additional action to attack, you cannot attack by simply bumping into enemies like Sonic. Speedy Dragon allows you to swing the bat while moving, but hit frame lags a bit and also finishes quickly, so at a high speed, if you only attack when you see the enemies, it's usually too late. Speedy Dragon's another difference from Sonic is, the camera view is closer to the character, thus everything shows up larger. It causes the field of view to be too narrow. For a game that consists of fast movements and complicated levels, this is a disastrous setup. Players often don't have the time to respond to changes in the game. In this game, the items you will collect the most are the baseballs, basically the same as the rings in Sonic. But perhaps it was limited by developers' programming skill, it won't all scatter away when the player is hit. It simply subtracts 10 baseballs from the number you have. While it makes the game somewhat more tolerant, it also loses the fun of recovering the lost rings. As for the level design, I don't feel there is much to talk about. There are nothing really too special or interesting, and most of the traps are just there to frustrate players. Maybe after you get more familiar with the levels, it won't feel as bad, but it's still not particularly fun. Additionally, each stage theme are only used for one level, unlike Sonic, which usually has 2 to 3 levels per theme, and there are only 6 levels in the whole game. Similar to Sonic again, you can enter a special level at certain checkpoints, but it is just to collecting baseballs within the time limit. There are no challenge objectives, and of course there are no Chaos Emeralds. If you don't compare it to Sonic, maybe it won't sound as bad. But when you clearly made a lesser clone, how could we overlook these shortcomings? Some game developers think it's not plagiarism if you just put in a few little changes, or even claim their differences as features. However, in many cases, the game is good because the entire design is coherent and consistent. Copying bits and pieces without understanding the whole picture is why most clones never come close to the original. Of course, the game is not without merits. At least, it's one of the few games that showcase Acan's high-speed parallax scrolling. And, what else? Okay, let's just move on to the next game. Super Chinese Professional Baseball League clearly is a baseball game focused on CPBL. In-game contents, teams, players are all based on CPBL's 6-year data. The game happened to be released when the 6th year officially ended. And just a few days later, Team Jungle Bears was sold and turned into Xinong Bears. A brand new game became out of date just like that. The timing couldn't have been worse. Some might think this was a port of PC game Chinese Professional Baseball League, but they just both happen to be CPBL licensed games. The contents and developers were different. Truthfully, this game wasn't completely new back then as well. There's a predecessor called World Pro Baseball 94 and was released on Mega Drive. The main difference is, the previous game only has the license from Brother Elephant's team, so only that team has real names and portraits of the players, while all other teams and players are imaginary. And this game has a full license from CPBL, containing all the actual team data. But gameplay-wise, they are almost identical. Visually, Super Chinese Professional Baseball League only has minor improvements on the color palette, but the music and sound effects changes are significant. Synthesized soundtracks become live recorded air horn and cheerleading. You can even hear chantings like and it quite accurately represents the atmosphere of baseball games in Taiwan. In terms of the gameplay, it's not too different from the baseball games in the early days. The game's control works, and the performance is fine. There are even cut-in animations for certain events. The most glaring flaw is the automatic defense often misses, but overall the gameplay isn't half bad. You can even select a few hidden Nippon professional baseball teams via secret code. Even though there are no real names and portraits, it's still quite clear which players they are referring to. Even all the ERA and AVG data are actual records from the previous season. This Easter egg will definitely make fans that watches both Taiwanese and Japanese pro baseball happy. Unfortunately, plagiarism in the game is pretty obvious. If you look at Power League 93 on PC Engine, you will see both games have virtually identical pitching and batting layout design. Even though all video games about baseball are essentially the same, but if you mirrored everything, including player stances, camera framing, and angle, umpire, what's your call? Now, after 20 years, the players featured in the game have all been retired. Only a few remain active as coaches on field. Playing the game isn't just digging through the history of Taiwanese video games, but also looking into the past of CPBL. We can more or less feel the atmosphere of the early days when the top teams, local legendaries, and even controversial match-fixing players were active. Also, several stadiums featured in the game are now demolished or rebuilt, so in a way, this game does provide valuable historical records. CUG is a game based on Chinese classic fantasy novel Journey to the West. In terms of game mechanics or visuals, it's not obvious if they try to copy a specific title or not, since most platformers at the time basically look like this. The main feature of the game is the variety of moves the protagonist Sun Wukong has, but it's not up to you to choose the moves. Instead, it's based on how much hit points that you have left. At different HP levels, the attack move changes accordingly. Other than melee attacks using a staff, you can also do range attacks with beads after you have acquired them. The beads come in different colors and some move in a really absurd trajectory, and players need to switch beads in different situations. You can also make special attacks, but it's determined by the blinking list on the top left of the screen. The effects are more or less the same though, hitting everything on screen or freezing everything. The game splits a level into several smaller sections, and the sceneries are quite well made with lots of variations. And in between the levels, the Earth God will occasionally provide you with some hints. Of course, there is a boss fight at the end of each level, and the gameplay at this point becomes something similar to a vertical shooter. However, these parabolic projectiles are the only weapon you have, and it feels kinda awkward to use. All in all, CUG's game control is pretty mediocre and the overall difficulty is rather high. There are many levels where you need to rely solely on trial and error to beat. Yes, there are many challenges, but they are mostly not fun to overcome. I guess I won't write off the game as worthless, but it doesn't stand out either. Super Dragon Force is a port of PC game Dragon Force on Acan. The title Super is there for a reason, because Super Dragon Force is not just a simple port. Instead, it's almost a complete remake. First of all, the flow of the game is quite different. The original Dragon Force is rather similar to Flame Dragon Knights, a famous SLG in Taiwan, with only dialogue scenes in between different missions. In the Acan version, you can actually walk around like in those classic 2D RPGs, finding items and treasure chests in the map. This makes the game resemble Shining Force more so than Flame Dragon Knights, which was heavily influenced by the former. In terms of level design and combat system, it's not that different from the PC version except for some number tweaking. However, the presentation is completely different. All the tiles and assets are remade, and even the combat layout is nothing alike, changed from a Shining Force-like shoulder view to an arguably simpler side view. While it makes the game feels like less of a clone, but you can definitely say that the combat layout is downgraded. The cutting animations for spell casting are also removed, and what's left are just small sprite animations in the map view. The overall gameplay is okay, I guess, though it can feel somewhat sluggish at times, especially when it comes to enemy movements. The AI is just so very slow. That made a game that was not very outstanding to begin with even more tedious to play. Also ported from PC, African Adventures is a Monopoly-like game, and the in-game characters are derived from historical figures such as Napoleon, Musashi Miyamoto, and Hitler. Don't get me wrong, Taiwanese people don't praise Hitler in any way, it's just not taboo in this regard. Strictly speaking, it's not the real Hitler either, as the character's name in Chinese happens to sound like Hitler, but the literal meaning is suck too happy, so it's only a homophonic pun. In addition to the normal properties that Monopoly has, African Adventures allows you to choose from more varieties of land usages, such as building farms, quarries, casinos, and traditional hotels. Farms and quarries will generate revenue at a regular interval, but only hotels can collect rent from other players that land on them. Nothing happens when you land on farms or quarries. The point of the game is not to bankrupt other players, but to find the treasure hidden in the middle of the map first. The point of earning money in the game is to buy consumables like ammo and food for the treasure hunt. When you have the required supplies, you will automatically enter the inner circle of the map to start a hunt. Since farms and quarries make money far more efficiently than hotels and casinos, and also the fact that they don't collect money from other players, monetary interactions seldom happen between players. Once most of the land has been bought, and if it's not distributed too unevenly, the game will become a rather monotonous grind. And it gets worse in the inner circle. You can only go around randomly, with random events determine the supplies are gained or lost, and the treasure itself can also only be found by chance. So even if you manage to find it, there isn't much sense of accomplishment. The mind games and the fun you normally associate with Monopoly are nowhere to be found. Most of these issues are improved in the African Adventures 2 on PC, so the problems we just discussed are only about the first game. The Acan port of African Adventures is visually identical to the PC version. The more notable difference is that trading is now done in a pop-up window instead of switching to a different full-screen menu, moderately improving the game's flow. There's also some balancing done under the hood, but without a side-by-side comparison, you probably won't notice it. Other than that, the Acan port added some voiceovers, but all the characters share the same voice set, so it's not really that impressive. My comments on this game is mostly based on the single player mode, so without a doubt it's a bit boring playing against the AI. If you manage to play with your family and friends, maybe it will be somewhat more fun. Just maybe. When gambling movies were very popular in Hong Kong and Taiwan in the 90s, Acan also had gambling lore that rode on the trend. All the in-game characters were portrayed by famous Hong Kong and Taiwan celebrities at the time, and then named after historical figures. Some of those celebrities are still very active to this date, while some others are barely recognized now. Even though the game is called Gambling Lord, but all it's got is mahjong. The rule obviously is based on the Taiwanese 16-tile rule. Overall, it's just an average mahjong game. No noteworthy presentations or highlights, and of course, no naked ladies either. Unfortunately, I was unable to acquire Magical Pool on Acan before filming, and there was no detailed info or any video about this game, leaving us only a few blurry screenshots as references. But at least we can know from these screenshots that the game has 4 different pool rule sets, as well as a World Championship mode. It also looks a bit like Side Pocket from Data East, and perhaps we can try to imagine Magical Pool in action by looking at that game. If you ever played Bomberman, then you pretty much played Boom Zoo, because it's basically Bomberman with cute animal costumes. The plagiarized elements are so apparent. From the rules to item design, they are all identical to Bomberman. For a clone, Boom Zoo is actually not bad. Performance and control-wise, it's pretty okay. And the visuals are well produced too. Apart from the single player mode, the versus mode is also available. It's just that the level design is pretty bland, and the way enemies move is sometimes quite annoying. Overall speaking, Boom Zoo is a generic clone of Bomberman, with most of the looks copied but falls short in the details. If you really want to play Bomberman and just happen not to have any of the consoles that have the game, and you happen to have a Acan console, then Boom Zoo would be your choice. Thus far, I've talked about all the released games on Acan. Yes, you heard right, all of Acan's released games, all 11 of them. Since Acan not only exited market very quickly, they seem to also stop all the software and hardware distribution right away, causing all the unreleased in-development games to be scrapped. This led to a situation that games that were announced before launch were still nowhere to be seen when Acan's production stopped, and the fact that there are more games cancelled than released. Due to my own stubbornness at digging through less-known histories, I won't let these cancelled games slip through so easily. Instead, we need to look into any piece of information available as best as we can to put together a more complete record for Acan. Let's talk about Rebel first. Reportedly, it was completed, but Acan had discontinued before the game could be launched, so it was never officially released and only a few sample cartridges were made. These samples eventually went to second-hand markets and collectors, and that's how we are able to learn about this unreleased game today. Rebel is a sci-fi hex-based strategy game, and looks a bit like Military Madness. But really, Rebel's quality doesn't even come close, making you wonder if it really was completed as rumored. First of all, as a mech-themed game, the mech designs are obviously very important. However, this game's mechanical art sucks. The unit sprites looks like walking office chairs, or even something you would find in your restrooms. Sure, it could just be the sprites on the map view are bad, and maybe the actual combat cut-ins can reveal more details. To my surprise, there are no combat cut-ins. It's just a few frames worth of sprite effect loops. Can't hardly get cheaper than this. Even though we usually turn off cut-in animations after a few times, that's really no excuse for simply not making them altogether. Wow, what's this? A nuke? That missile looks pretty powerful. Well, it looks like nothing happened to the enemy. So I later realized that you have to look at the stats dialog to see the hit points changing. I can live without cutting animations, but why you don't even show the damage number? Worse yet, the soundtracks just don't fit the game at all. This kind of music makes you wonder if you are on a field trip and not fighting. The game's pace is already slow to begin with, plus the underwhelming musics and visuals. The game really is a test on players' patience. Even though Acan's lineup was quite lacking, but I guess it wasn't much of a loss that this game didn't get released. Rebel was the last Acan game with an official product number, so most likely other unreleased games were all incomplete. Information on these works can only be found in old gaming magazines of that time. Other than the one and only issue of Acan magazine, I also went to the Taiwan National Central Library to borrow TV Game Report magazine from 20 years ago, trying to dig up some information on Acan's unreleased games. Let's start with Deep Earth Adventure, a first-person RPG. First glance, it looks similar to Dungeon Master or Eye of Beholder, but if you pay attention, you will notice that this game has smoother camera control and not just 90-degree turns. In fact, its now defunct game developer Taiwan Soft Technology released a PC game called The Maze before Deep Earth Adventure. Even though it's just a clone of Ultima Underworld, but it's also a very rare Taiwanese-made 3D game at the time. Deep Earth Adventure clearly uses the same 3D engine, and it would have been Acan's performance showcase if it was completed and released. It's quite a pity that this game didn't see the light of day. The information on the next few games I'm going to show are unfortunately very sparse, only a few screenshots per game, such as fighting game Wulong Yuan, strategy game Dino War, and racer romance that looks just like Hang On. For the rest of the unreleased Acan games, the only info I can get hold of is just the names on the supposed release schedule. However, we can still deduct some interesting things from that. For example, CNE's Mega Drive releases, including quiz game Arcane Huanpao, Taiwan Tycoon, a clone of Momotaro Dentist, and RPG Beggar Prince, were all listed in Acan's software lineup. There was even a brand new Taiwan Tycoon 2. In fact, CNE made a few well-produced Famicom and Mega Drive games, but they were never able to get an official license from Nintendo or Sega, and had to release them as unlicensed products. Finally, there was a platform that's closer to home. It's pretty obvious that they put a lot of hope and resource into it. To their dismay, Acan didn't exactly go well. It's possible that this caused CNE to quit game developing altogether. There were a few other games in the lineup that were also on PC. Dynasty International's Funny Sango, Softstar's Richman, Age of Magic, and Age of Magic 2. But with limited data, we can't be sure if these Acan games were the same as the PC versions. Finally, there actually is another surprising source of information. The hidden room in Son of Evil actually is modeled after Funtex Studio. In this room, players can talk to Acan's development staff and game developers. Other than the developers of Son of Evil, there are also a few other teams in the room. Most importantly, if you check out the posters near the corresponding dev team, it will play the music of that game and show you related images. And none of the games shown here are released except for CUG. These games include the previously mentioned Dino War, disaster education game City Escape, and adventure game Quick Strike. These images can't represent the whole game, but nonetheless are very valuable. And the fact that it also plays short soundtracks of the games is preserving history in a way that no printed media can. The dev team probably wouldn't anticipate that a few product placements will one day become valuable historical records. Alright, I can't go on without mentioning this. In this room, every time you pass through a door, an Acan voiceover will be played. The design of this in-joke just happens to preserve the official pronunciation of Acan. I was never sure of how to say Acan correctly. Acan, or Acan, until I heard it in game for the first time here. Now I finally know how to pronounce it. Acan. After all these discussions on Acan, finally let's talk a bit about why Acan exited the market so quickly. The most obvious reason, when Acan was released, Sega Saturn and PlayStation were competing for dominance. People behind Acan originally thought that next-gen consoles were too expensive and unlikely to be very popular at first, but they didn't foresee the console war escalated so quickly. The situation forced down the prices of both 32-bit consoles in a very short period of time. On the other hand, the older 16-bit consoles were reaching development maturity. They had not only higher quality games, but also a much larger library, while the newcomer Acan was still very much unfamiliar to its developers. Even though the hardware spec was a little better, the software just fell short. Also, consider one embarrassing fact that Taiwan's market was full of pirated cartridges, discs, and CDs at the time. So even if Acan games were cheaper than Japanese imported games, piracy made a price gap not really an issue. Thus, it's unsurprising that Acan wasn't attractive to most gamers back then. However, game customers were not limited to gamers who were knowledgeable about gaming. There's another group, namely the parents, who knew little about gaming brands and trends, and possibly only knew about getting cheap Famiclones and pirated games for kids. By pitching Acan as a machine that costs a little more while being much more powerful, and this machine has games that are in Chinese and educational, or other similar marketing strategy, it could have a chance in the lower price and kids market. This is why I think Acan's management still pushed ahead with their plans, even though strong players are already on the market, as Acan was not intended to compete against next-gen consoles, but to take the enormous low-end and Chinese market in Taiwan and China. If next-gen consoles were not the main reason why Acan failed, then what was the real cause? In fact, Acan's exit wasn't gradual at all. It just suddenly disappeared after a certain point in time. There were no official reasons for canceling the Acan project, and UMC seemed also to regard Acan as a forbidden topic. As an outsider, I have no way of knowing, but there was an event that caused a lot of speculations. In 1991, Nintendo of America sued UMC about piracy problems. Next year, they further accused Taiwan government for indulging pirated exports and seriously infringed Nintendo's copyright. They requested USTR to escalate Taiwan's designation as priority foreign country under the Special 301 report. The reason being that many of the pirated consoles and cartridges found in the US often contain chips from UMC. Perhaps we can say UMC just manufactured those under contract and had no intention of infringement. But as Taiwan government owned stock in UMC, the fact that they were the main chip provider in those products could be seen as evidence that Taiwan government didn't bother too much about copyrights. This could be one major incentive for UMC to start develop their own game consoles. Because if it worked, it would have helped Taiwan's hardware and software industries to move away from piracy, get rid of the outsourcing manufacturer identity and shady business environments. There were rumors saying that it's precisely the ramification of this lawsuit that caused the termination of Acan. However, UMC and Nintendo already reached a settlement in early 1994, which was before Acan was even announced. So unless there were other disputes, otherwise the timeline just didn't fit Acan's termination. About the same time, UMC also released their own 486 compatible CPU called Green CPU, and brought Intel's lawyers and lawsuits upon themselves. That pretty much ended UMC's self-developed processor brand forever. This indeed has some similarities with Acan's situation. Whatever the reason, Acan vanished from the market very quickly, while most people might not even be aware of it. It's very unfortunate that it turned out this way. Sure, it's very lacking on both hardware and software aspects, but if we never take the first step, how could there be improvements to follow? Regrettably, with Acan's failure, it basically ended Taiwan's game console industry. And looking at the game industry of Taiwan now after 20 years, it really was a pity. Purely from a gamer's perspective, it would be a stretch to say Acan's a console worth buying. There are only that many games, while most of them have much better counterparts. Many years after Acan's demise, it can only be regarded as a rare and weird product, only interesting to passionate video game collectors both domestic and abroad. Though I documented this console partly out of my own interests, but moreover I wanted to leave something behind for the video game industry of Taiwan, as it's important for one to face and cherish the history of one's homeland. When I decided to start documenting Acan, I basically had nothing to work with. But by chance, the moment I posted my request to borrow an Acan console and the games on the internet, I got responses immediately. I have to thank Mr. Xie for kindly lending me 2 Acan consoles and several games. Without his help, I could not have been able to make this video. Also, I have to thank many people for their help on providing videos and photo materials. There are lots of people working quietly to preserve many aspects of Taiwan's history, but there are always more that we can do. As the first generation of people growing up with video games, we have the responsibility to preserve and pass on our culture. That's it for this episode. Thank you for watching and see you next time.